To speak of the slum is to speak of a certain urban formation. Slums are synonymous with social conditions which define them. Slums are beset by poverty. They're the product of industrialization. They have become also a factor now in post-colonialism, which means that slums are still with us. Photographers began to communicate the conditions of the slum to those outside, and did so, let it be said, for various reasons. On the one hand, to produce true documents, we might say, photographic, realistic documents of life in the slum, so that these conditions could be changed. The other, more problematic reason was to provide a kind of entertainment about how the other half lives. The photographs of Thomas Burke are an excellent example of this sort of double-edged aspect of slum photography. Burke, who lived in Liverpool, began to photograph in the 1890s. On the one hand, he was a poultry and fish dealer, and on the other hand, he was a city councillor. So he was engaged in the sort of social politics, the social life of the city. It was Burke who set his mind to the task of producing a set of images of life of the poor. What they show is very much in the how the other half lives sort of model, but they oftentimes were hand-colored, so they err on the side of entertainment rather than on the side of instruction. Some of the scenes that he shot, for example, are little girls playing Ring Around a Rosie in a town square. There is a bobby in the background surveying the scene. There's an amazing shot of a sidewalk second-hand vendor who has all of the boots and shoes that she has for sale, and then a poignant picture of an elder sister and two younger toddlers who are standing outside what looks to be a pie shop. Familiar stuff, rather poignant really, and part, I think, of this double-edged aspect that slum photography could have. Jacob Riis is one of the most influential of the 19th century slum photographers. He was concerned as an immigrant himself to show precisely the conditions under which the poor were living in New York City. Those conditions were grim. Hell's Kitchen, one of the great slum areas of the city, just by virtue of its name, speaks loudly to what these places were like. There was no sanitation, the streets were unpaved, all the tenements were crowded with people. Riis was committed to a photographic practice which would show these conditions, and he was able to do so because he had not only the advantage of a handheld camera, but also the newly invented phenomenon of flash photography. He takes us inside and shows us large families squished into a room and working there. An Italian family, all of them together, 4, 5, 6 of them, rolling cigars. I think too of his interest in homeless boys, of which there were endless numbers. They were called street Arabs at the time, which with the name communicating something of their nomadic life. There's a photograph of 3 of these little kids, filthy, tattered, and piled up sort of like kittens or puppies over a vent, over a grater, just to keep warm as the night goes on. The work that he did in New York did cause change. We know this for a fact. Slums were cleared, parks were built, ventilation and paving arrived in New York. And this is one of the reasons why his work continues to mean so much. Louis Hines can be thought of as a successor to Jacob Riis, partly because he was 25 years younger. Hines was educated as a sociologist at Columbia University in New York, and he went from there to become a teacher. He decided to instruct his students in photography, and they used the city as their subject. They began by photographing immigrants as they arrived on Manhattan. But from there, he became much more involved in what happened to the life of these new arrivals. Heinz was interested above all in the problem of child labor. He traveled up and down the eastern seaboard into the Midwest in order to picture the conditions under which children worked in the factory. A typical Heinz photograph shows us row upon row upon row of enormous machines that dwarf their childish operators, as they were called. I'm thinking about the great textile mills of the 19th century, with fast-running machines that never stopped, endlessly turning and turning, weaving and spinning, with moving parts and with deafening noise. The result, it doesn't take a big imagination to figure this out, was bodies that were maimed, lives that were lost, hearing that was lost. It took Heinz's collaboration with people who did care about this to begin to cause some sort of reaction to these conditions. But it took 30 years from the time that Heinz took his first photograph of children at work in 1908 until the final abolition of child labor in the US. Perhaps the most remarkable body of photographs of the slums of Britain was made by a British photographer, Hedges, in the years 1969 through 1971. Its purpose was to address a housing crisis which was felt nationwide. There were 3 million people at the time living in inadequate housing in Britain. One of the most interesting aspects of Hedges' work was the consciousness he brought to the interaction between himself and the people who he was shooting. He was well aware that there was a relationship involved, that it wasn't merely a matter of transcribing something we could call reality. There's a picture of a small family, a mother and 2 children, who are in a forecourt in some sort of otherwise unspecified apartment dwelling. The little boy is fumbling at the lock, the mother is sweeping up the courtyard, and there is a little baby in a carriage, all of them absorbed in their different occupations. There's photographs where the sense of real dis-ease is stark. One of them that comes to my mind is perhaps the most painful of the lot. It shows a little girl in the foreground looking with this sort of in a state of distraction, a kind of painful distraction, I might say, at the photographer. And then in the rear of this sort of desolate room, a man is standing, his back to the camera and his head bowed down. It is as painful a moment of family life as I can bring to mind. Something about the sheer despair in the man's attitude has been captured. Hedges cites his fascination with the work of American photographers who were employed during the Depression. His great inspiration of all of these photographers was James Agee and his photographic collaborator, Walker Evans. In 1936, they went to rural Alabama and there spent little short of a month living with 3 different families. If we look back and forth between Evans's work and Hedges' work, we see point after point of intersection. Parents and children, domestic space, looked at straightforwardly, but also by people who are looking back, by people who are well aware that a project is afoot with which they are collaborating. But above all, what they have in common, Hedges and Evans, is their devotion to ordinary life. In a remarkable statement, Hedges makes this crystal clear. He says, "History should be about how ordinary citizens live, interrelate and treat each other. To paraphrase Salvador Allende, history is ours, it is made by the people."